This session was designed to help participants gain a better understanding and appreciation of system thinking and how it can support leaders in developing more effective and durable food system solutions. This is the 4th salon in our capacity building webinar series and the first of 3 being produced in partnership between Ag Innovations Network and Roots of Change. In just a moment, Doris Meyer will introduce herself and share a bit about Roots of Change and the California Food Policy Council. She'll take us through the housekeeping and technical details for today's salon, and then I'll introduce Katy Mamen, who's our great keynote speaker for the afternoon. And we'll have some time for questions throughout and at the end. And Doris, I think maybe if we can get the rest of the call muted, I'm hearing a lot of feedback on my end.
Okay, I can go ahead and mute everyone for now.
Great. Thank you.
The conference has been muted. The conference has been unmuted.
And other leaders from all over our food system. So I'd like to share just a bit about AIN and the Salon series before we move forward. AIN convenes coalitions at the local, regional, and state level to solve complex problems in our food system. At the local level, we facilitate 6 county-based alliances, and at the state level, we convene roundtables that target several areas, including ag and the environment, water, land use, labor, and housing. These coalitions really act as a hub for food system knowledge in their respective areas and lead projects such as assessments, policy and community action plans, on-farm programs, and aim to act as a really strong voice for sustainable food systems across the state. This salon is one piece of a larger statewide capacity building suite that aims to connect leaders to share knowledges and best practices for food system change and really some support to the how of food system change. We will hold 2 more salons before the year is out, one on September 9th on using teams effectively and identifying strategies for committees. And on November 11th, we'll explore finding some common ground, discussing valued centers approaches to bridging sometimes divisive perspectives that we can find in our work. Similar to this webinar, you'll receive some detailed information and registration announcements about a month before each event. So that's about enough for me for now, and here is Doris Meyer with Roots of Change.
All right, thank you, Lisa. Hi, everyone. My name is Doris Meyer, and I'm the project coordinator for Roots of Change. And we are very excited to be part of this collaboration with Ag Innovations Network for these Salon webinars. Just a quick introduction to Roots of Change. Our mission is to create a collaborative network of leaders and institutions to establish a sustainable food system in California by the year 2030. Roots of Change is also the backbone of the California Food Policy Council, which is a unique collaboration of local food policy bodies, food system reform organizations, and government officials around the state. The goal of the California Food Policy Council is to advocate for food systems change in California, and we do this through building the capacity of local food policy bodies, finding common ground and policy priorities, generating public support for those policies, and educating policymakers on issues in our food system. Before we go on to introduce today's presenter, I have the glamorous task of going over some housekeeping items with you. So first off, to avoid any background noise, I will, as soon as the presentation starts, mute everyone on the call. I attempted that before, but I realized I also muted Lisa, and then nobody could hear her. If you'd like to unmute yourself, you can do that by pressing *7 on your phone, and then to mute yourself, *6. Again, *7 to unmute yourself, and *6 to mute yourself again. We will take a quick break in the middle of the presentation for questions, and there will also be a short Q&A session at the end of the webinar. During the presentation, We ask you to please use the chat feature. You'll see a button in the top left corner of your screen in order to pose your questions during the webinar instead of interrupting. Please keep in mind, because we only have a limited amount of time available, we will only be able to answer a few questions during the webinar, but we'll do our best to answer them by email after the webinar. And lastly, I want to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded and that there will be a short survey at the very end of the presentation. It will pop up on your screen right after the meeting is over. We would appreciate it if you could complete it, and thank you in advance for doing that. This is all for the housekeeping items. Again, I will mute everyone as soon as the presentation begins. And Lisa, do you want to introduce our presenter?
Sure. That would be great. Thanks, Doris. And thanks to Roots of Change and the Food Policy Council for all of their help with today's salon. All right, everyone. We are in for quite a treat today. Katy Mamen is here to share some of her really, really extensive and tremendous experience in sustainable food systems and in food system thinking. She is a great friend of AIN and has a wealth of experience in California food and agriculture. Until not too long ago, she served as our program director here with AIN and led our Alliance program and our Roundtable programs for several years. Prior to that role, she was a consultant to numerous food and ag organizations around California and coordinated the U.S. local food program at the International Society for Ecology and Culture. She has deep training in system thinking, and we are thrilled to have her today with us. So please, Katy, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa and Doris. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. And Doris, it looks like I'm the one with a number ending in 6111.
111. Okay,
Yeah,
so hold on 1 minute. I'm going to mute everyone and then unmute you.
Great.
Hold on 1 second.
The conference has been muted.
Katy, can you hear me?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
You can hear me now. Okay, great.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Well, I will go ahead and start. I'm going to go ahead here and share my desktop so you can see my presentation. And there we go. Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for being here with us today. I'm really honored that you chose this webinar over the World Cup game between Brazil and Germany. Really happy about that. And I'm really excited to share with you some of these ideas and principles. I really believe that a systems approach is a powerful way that we can look at the challenges of the food system and also find some ways to really break through a lot of the gridlock that we face in these issues. I've been working on systems thinking for about the last 10 or 15 years. I'm still learning a lot about it. It's one of those things that you can really delve into for a lifetime, and I'm really excited about that. So let's see. This is just my email information and the link to more information on the web. We'll get back to that at the end of the webinar as well. So just before we dive into the content, I just want to give you a quick overview. We're going to be covering several elements of systems on our call today. We're going to look at why we want to take a systems approach. Then we'll delve into some basic kind of core concepts of systems and systems dynamics. We'll look at systems thinking, which is a way of looking at the world and approaching problems that emerges out of systems theory. And then we'll look at some concrete ways to apply that to our work in food and agriculture. It's really a lot to cover in an hour. I just want to emphasize that this is a real survey, kind of a tasting plate of these concepts. And I would just really encourage everyone to focus in on the webinar. We'll be moving pretty quickly through some of these ideas. So I'm also going to be giving this presentation using Prezi, which is a presentation software that differs slightly from our usual PowerPoint approach. So I just want to start again with why we want to take a systems lens. I think we're all aware that we face a huge array of challenges in food and agriculture, and while we've made some strides here and there over the years in addressing problems, I'm guessing we'd all like to see more headway be made on the overall health of the whole food system. I think it's increasingly clear that food-related problems, everything from farm-scale problems like invasive pests and water availability, all the way through to hunger and food insecurity, can no longer and can never really be understood in isolation, that all of these challenges are interrelated. The food system is a complex system. It's a very complicated system that involves the human realm as well as the biophysical realm, and linear cause and effect responses are rarely effective, or they have unexpected consequences that may limit the efforts that we're making in the first place. So systems thinking is a real approach that can help us with that. And also with all these multiple crises, we don't have the luxury of time or resources to address them one by one. Systems are nonlinear, so the results are not always proportional to the effort we put in. A systems lens can really help us identify the places where the smallest interventions can lead to the biggest impact or change across the whole system. So more specifically, systems thinking can help us move forward more strategically and effectively in our work to create healthy food systems. It can do that by deepening our ability to see and understand the whole food system. And through that understanding, it also allows us to hone our view and our understanding of the parts or individual challenges that we may be working on as the core of our work, of our individual efforts. Taking a systems approach also allows us to see the hidden connections between our target issue and the other challenges in the food system. And in doing so, it allows us to identify the most powerful places to make change. It allows us to attack the root causes more so than the symptoms. And in really looking at these, across the whole system, it allows us to forge powerful new alliances so that we can really see new opportunities to open up unlikely and powerful new partnerships. Systems approaches really explore the behavior of the complex systems. It's really been applied to a wide variety of fields, all the way from engineering, computer science, through to biology and psychology and business. A couple of the areas that I've found most useful, where it's been most coherently communicated, include the work of Peter Senge and colleagues in the management field, and also Fritjof Capra's work communicating the systems lens in ecology and biological systems. So this is a quote from one of the early systems thinkers, Donella Meadows, that systems problems will yield only as we reclaim our intuition, stop casting blame, see the system as a source of its own problems, and find the courage and wisdom to restructure it. Ultimately, we're all interested in building healthy food systems. The question is, how do we engage the system to effect positive change? At the broadest level, some of these leading systems thinkers have framed this challenge as a crisis of perception, that underlying all of these problems, we're stuck in an outdated way of thinking about the world. So that leadership today requires a new way of thinking about and approaching the challenges of our time. Let's take, for example, this problem. This sentence on the screen right now has 3 mistakes. Can you find them? This is a kind of a problem that requires systems thinking to answer. So just have a look at that for a moment, and we'll come back to this a little bit later in the hour after exploring some of the key ideas of the systems approach. So just getting started into systems concepts, I want to cover 4 ideas that are core to a systems view: emergent properties, boundaries, inputs and outputs, and feedback loops. So just before we do that, I want to dive in for a sec to make sure we're all on the same page about what a system is. A system can be defined as an interconnected set of elements that is coherently organized in a way that achieves something. So there are 3 key elements here: the parts, the elements, the interconnections, or the way that those parts are organized, the way that they hang together to form a whole, and the achieving something. That systems tend to have a purpose. They're doing something. So for example, an airplane is a system. It can be thought of as a system. It's got parts. It's got wings and a windshield and an engine, etc. And these parts are organized in a way to allow it to achieve something. It can fly people from A to B. Similarly, the world, the globe, or the Earth, can be thought of as a system. It's got parts which include the air, it includes the biological system, it includes the physical system. And all of these parts interact in a way to achieve something, which achieves lots of things actually. For example, the regulation of global climate. Down here, conversely, we have a box of parts. While we have the elements, they're not coherently organized and connected in a way that achieves something. So that is not defined as a system. Now, a food system. I'm sure all of us have grappled at one point or another with the many different definitions of a food system. There are lots of different ways of looking at a food system. So here's one example. A food system includes all the processes and infrastructure, so the connections and the parts involved in feeding a population. And it lists those parts. There are lots of different ways to represent a food system, and in fact, how we define it sets the realm of what's possible. So I want to just introduce the idea of mapping systems or modeling them. And this is a very simple systems map of the food system. Systems modeling is the backbone of real systems dynamics. So this can get very scientific and techy. We're not going to go into that. But just so everybody has a picture of that, we use systems modeling for things like the kind of general circulation models that are the science that underpin predictions about climate change. We use systems to map biogeochemical cycles that explore the movement of elements through the land and air. And again, this is a basic food system map for a local or regional food system. So again, it's obviously oversimplified, but just to show there are parts, they're connected in a way, and it achieves something. In this case, we can say a food system aims to achieve, feeding a population nutritious food or sustaining the local economy. So the map has elements, it has flows. In this case, what's flowing is food and money, and that's being depicted here. And we're also noticing, maybe not so much in this case, but we often find that the interconnections between the parts and systems operate through the flow of information. That information is often what holds systems together and plays a really important role in determining how they operate. So just to cover these four ideas, the first is emergent properties. And emergent properties are the qualities of the system that can't be predicted by the parts alone. It's often captured in the phrase, the whole is more than the sum of the parts, so that they're really not evident in the parts, these properties, and they're difficult to predict when they're looking at the parts. So again, with the Earth, the regulation of global climate, or the airplane allowing people to fly from one place to another can be seen as emergent properties. In the case of a person, that human system, one emergent property we might think of there is health, or the regulation of body temperature. Down here, in the case of multiple people or an organization can be thought of as a system. And one of the emergent properties there might be the fulfillment of the organization's mission, that all the parts of the organization are working together, and that one of the outcomes at the system level is that. Similarly, a farm system, that the performance of a farm is difficult to predict when we're considering the crops alone or the human resources or labor alone. It's a whole system, and in order to understand the performance of the whole system, we need to look at it at that level. So that's the idea of emergence or emergent properties. And just quickly, we've also got here the second piece, which is boundaries. And we talked about that a little bit. And this is really how we define a system. We can't just place boundaries wherever we want. It can't be haphazard. The boundaries around a system have to be drawn at these natural resting points where it forms a whole. So everywhere we draw a boundary, in this case, this dotted line represents a boundary around the local food system. And we see outside of there we have imported food coming in. In every system, we have inputs and outputs. So here we have inputs into production. So that could include things like seeds or fertilizer. And in this case, they're being depicted as coming from outside of the local food system. And then the waste here is being depicted as leaving that system. So this idea that every system is nested within a bigger system. So the boundaries we draw around a system limit or define that system, but it's always nested within a bigger system. For example, if we're looking at, say, this part of the presentation that's shown here, we know that that's nested within a bigger system or a bigger piece, which is this whole presentation. And we may find that's further nested within a bigger system. So it's just this idea of that every system fits within a bigger system, and that's important as we look at how the inputs and outputs and how the system relates to the outside world. So I'm just going to pause here. Before we go into the last concept, I'd actually like to show a short video. It's an advertisement or commercial for Walmart. And then I want to use that commercial as just a real-world example for us to explore the final concept here, which is feedback loops, but then also going into the final piece of how we apply this in our work. So I'm going to go ahead and show this. It's about a minute long. The sound may be a little bit low, but we'll just do our best to hear it. But just really take a look at this, and then we'll come back to analyze it a little bit after that. So here we are. This is the Live Better commercial by Walmart.
I'm a farmer. I consider myself a family farmer. Farming has been a part of me all of my life. We grow watermelons, collard greens, okra, squash. I raise a lot of pumpkins, peas, and we also grow strawberries. We're doing the same thing that the largest farmer does, but we're just doing it on a smaller scale. It's important to support local farmers because it's local business. Without Walmart, I wouldn't be here today. It's been a huge part of my business.
They're making a big difference in the farming community by featuring small local growers like us. Local farmers, kind of like the heart of America.
To grow healthy, fresh produce coming right out the ground and share it with the community. That's rewarding to me.
I love being able to see a seed placed in the ground and transformed.
It's just, oh, this is the end product. It's just so refreshing. It's sweet. It's juicy. It came from our hands.
Farming is what I love to do. We're trying to build for the future.
Okay. There we go. So this is an advertisement about Walmart's efforts to procure local food. I'm just going to go back into our full screen mode and dig into this concept of feedback loops. So feedback loops are really key to systems thinking. It really shifts the way that we see cause and effect. And we'll take a look at some causal loop diagrams. So really in systems thinking, we shift from linear cause and effect thinking to loops, where the change in one variable produces changes in others that ultimately affect the change in that first variable. So we'll get into that a little bit. We've got two types of feedback loops, balancing loops and reinforcing loops. And I'll explain what those are in just a sec. So, in a kind of a linear way of thinking, we could look at maybe the message of this commercial. So the idea is that as Walmart implements this local campaign, or campaign to promote local produce, we see an increase in small farmer profits as more and more small and mid-scale farmers sell to Walmart, and that improves rural economic health. So that's just kind of a linear way of capturing the message from this commercial. And of course, underneath that, we might imagine that internally in the business strategy, Walmart's thinking that as they increase the local campaign, they'll have more people shopping at their stores, which will lead to more profits for the retailer. So this is a linear way of thinking about that. And if we take this bottom line and turn that into a loop, feedback loop, it might look something like this. As Walmart increases the marketing of local produce, they're increasing. So we mark the direction that one change leads to in the next variable. So as marketing of local produce increases, we'll see an increase, change in the same direction, in the number of patrons to Walmart. As we see an increase in the number of patrons, we're likely to see an increase in profit margins. And as profit margins go up, it's likely that Walmart's going to reinvest in local marketing. So that this is called a reinforcing loop for the retailer. This means that as we change one thing, it results in a cascade of causal effects that then increases the initial change to begin with. So this is called a virtuous cycle, which means you're increasing something you want to be increasing. It's called a vicious cycle if it's something you don't want, like runaway global climate change would be a series of positive feedback loops that we don't want. But in systems thinking, we're not just looking at the core thing, we're wanting to kind of expand out and look at some other key dynamics there. So what we might see is that there's a balancing loop here, that as the marketing of local produce increases, we see an increase in contracting challenges. So that this, this might include getting enough supply from a local grower, having regular deliveries throughout the year. It might include billing issues that one large retailer would encounter with small growers. So that as the challenges increase, it would put a limiting effect on the marketing of local produce. That's called a balancing loop, and balancing loops are also known as negative feedback loops, and they're ways that systems kind of balance themselves and maintain kind of a homeostasis. So another loop at play here, and this is the last loop we'll look at here, is that this is another balancing loop. As the marketing of local produce increases, the constraints in the farm operation increase. So if you look at an individual farm level, a local kind of small-scale or mid-scale grower who gets a new contract selling to Walmart, at that level, there may be some new terms placed on that contract, right? There's a need for expensive equipment. For example, if you sell to Walmart, you have to be able to load the trucks, and of course, to load these huge trucks, you need to invest in a forklift. There's a narrow terms in terms of the appearance of produce that's allowed. There may be restrictions on production practices and ultimately a low return. So that as these constraints increase on the farm by contracting with a large-scale grower, you might find that profit margins go down. So as constraints increase, profit margins decrease. There's an opposite effect. And as profit margins decrease, there's kind of an decrease in the marketing of local produce. And this is actually mislabeled here at the bottom. That should say same. So in any case, this is a balancing loop. You've got two sames and one opposite. That is a negative feedback loop. So putting these all together, this is just really pointing out the structural limitations that limit or impede the ability of Walmart to continually increase the marketing of local produce. So this is the main loop that we've got, we've been looking at. Increase in marketing local produce, more people to the store, more profits. But that is being balanced by these loops. And that is in effect limiting growth of the local produce marketing here. So it's really about telling a story of what's happening, of some of the challenges that we face by putting together these loops and cycles. So really, I'm not going to go into any more detail. Again, we're just kind of covering some of the core ideas here, but I just want to emphasize that systems mapping is a powerful tool. There are several important systems archetypes or common behaviors of systems, and that really understanding those, and there's a lot of good material out there on how to understand those systems and how to effectively intervene in them. So systems mapping can also help us be really conscious of and reduce the unintended consequences that so often accompany our interventions. The real takeaway here is not how to do systems mapping so much as that this is a really helpful approach that as change makers in the food system we could choose to learn more about. But what's also really important here is the thinking, the way of thinking and looking at the world that comes out of that. And I'll go into that in just a sec, but before I do, I just want to emphasize that there's a lot of work that's been done out there to kind of map out the food system. This is one example from an organization called Nourish. And it's just nice to look at these kinds of maps to get a feel for how people are thinking about the food system and really just, cross-reference with our own thinking and how we're looking at the challenges that we're working on. Okay, so I'm just going to go in here for a minute to systems thinking, the kind of thinking that emerges, and then we'll have a chance for a a couple of questions before moving on to the last piece. So again, I just want to emphasize that systems thinking, or the way of looking at the world and challenges that come out of systems theory, can be seen really as a perspective or a language. The principles of systems thinking are really important. So we don't need to know all the science, but really getting some of these core principles can really serve us in understanding and intervening in systems. So again, systems thinking is a language for describing and understanding the behavior of systems, and that can help us see how to change systems more effectively. So looking at that level of the way we look at the world differently, I just want to highlight some of these ideas of shifting from conventional thinking, which is prevalent or dominant in our society today, that really emerges from more of a scientific worldview that really is about breaking systems down into their parts and focusing there to a systems point of view. So really, this can be summarized as follows, that in conventional thinking we have a main focus on the parts. Conversely, in systems thinking, the main emphasis is on the relationships among a system's parts rather than the parts themselves. It really argues that parts can be best understood in the context of the whole. The next thing is that conventional thinking tends to emphasize objects and has kind of a content orientation, whereas systems thinking really emphasizes those relationships within a system from element to element, but also between the system that you're looking at and the broader context. The structure of a system gives rise to its behavior, and we can explain that using these causal loops or feedback loops. So rather than thinking of linear cause and effect, we tend to think of this dynamic set of loops that feeds back on itself. And I just want to pause here because I think this is incredibly powerful, because this is really about shifting the blame, so that rather than pointing the finger at one part or one person or one element, it's really looking at the structural issues that cause the bad behaviors that we're seeing. So again, the emphasis is on structural issues rather than personal blame. And the nature of systems problems really is undesirable behaviors are characteristic of the system structures that produce them. Just the second to last point here is that in a conventional or scientific thinking, we tend to look for the right view. What's the right way of looking at this problem? Whereas in systems thinking, we recognize that there are lots of different points of view, depending on where you sit in the system, and incorporating all of those points of view in our strategy on how to move forward is key. And finally, we're moving from objective to contextual knowledge, recognizing that the context gives meaning to the system. So those are just some of the principles of systems thinking. I want to just pause there, and we can take maybe 3 or 4 minutes to see if there are any questions. Doris, can I hand it over to you here?
Sure. I don't see any questions that came through the chat feature here.
Okay,
but let me unmute everyone, and so maybe there's some people who have questions now.
The conference has been unmuted.
Any questions at this point? Okay. Well, why don't we hold it there then, Doris, and then just everybody, I would just invite you to, as we're continuing through, feel free to just mark down any questions or comments that you have, and we'll take maybe 5 or 10 minutes at the end to have an opportunity to go deeper into any questions or observations that you'd like to make. So, Doris, did you want to mute everybody again?
I'll mute everyone again except for you.
Okay.
The conference has been muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good. Well, I'll continue on then to the last piece that I wanted to share here in the presentation, which is applying some of these systems concepts and systems thinking to the way we approach problems in food and agriculture. So there are 5 points that I'd like to make here in applying a systems approach to food and ag. The first 2 have to do with the way we frame problems. So the first is that we can apply some of these tools of systems mapping to the problem at hand here. So again, so we can kind of look at some of the loop diagrams that we saw earlier in the Walmart example, and thinking about it that way, and just taking an opportunity to sit back and you can start by looking at the core problem that or core issue that you're interested in, and then just simply take some time to say, okay, well, when that changes in this direction, what happens? What does that lead to? And then when that changes, what does that lead to? And you can start building some of these feedback loops. And that can just deepen our understanding of some of the core dynamics at play. And then we can also use that kind of map to look at our interventions and how they might be impacting the system and even possibly creating some unintended consequences. So some of the guiding questions you might ask in doing this and looking at the problems or challenges from a systems perspective, you might look at how we're defining the system. What might some unintended consequences be? Have the key activities and relationships within the system, have they been captured? Where am I placing my system boundaries? What's the context, and what are the main influences that the context has on the system? How can we understand that? How is the system organized? What's flowing between the nodes in the system? So some of these questions can really be helpful in helping us think a little more deeply about it. And again, just really understanding the causality that with systems problems, the cause tends not to be the blame of one person, but again, it often lies in the structure of the system. And that can be really powerful because, for example, with the Walmart case, so if I was interested in deep systems change and I saw that commercial, it might be easy to kind of blame Walmart, for example. Oh, I don't like Walmart's doing, and I want to get rid of Walmart. Let's get rid of Walmart. But then if we look at it really from a systems point of view, we might understand that getting rid of one company, that the economic structures that caused perhaps the behaviors we didn't like are still existing, and so another company might take its place. So it's really, shifting the blame from individual actions that we're seeing to the underlying structures, and that can be really liberating and powerful. Just another example of that is the idea of local food. So obviously there's been a huge interest in the concept of local food for a variety of reasons. But when we look at that, and when we define local food in strict terms and quantitative terms, like food grown within a 100-mile radius or food grown within the state, that's I would argue that that's a narrow way of defining it. But rather, if we were to define it in a systems way, we might say we're interested in localization. So we're looking at the underlying structures in the food system, and we're seeing kind of a constant scaling up. Maybe we want to be looking at facilitating structures that support thriving regional food systems. So it's not about buying this broccoli from 5 miles closer to home, and it's not about eliminating all global trade, but it's shifting the emphasis and the linkages to be closer. We're simplifying the system. We're eliminating a lot of links, and that's just a different way of conceiving of food localization from a systems point of view. The second piece about how we look at the problems is that we really want to be focusing on identifying the patterns and exploring the underlying structures beneath the events and behaviors that we're seeing. And one really helpful tool for doing that is the iceberg model. And this is one tool that I just love. I use it a lot. I think about it a lot. And I'm really happy to share this. I'm sure some of you have seen this before. But again, really, this is the reason why it's called the iceberg model is because, like an iceberg, most of what's going on we can't see, right? We see the events that are happening above the waterline. And with systems thinking, we want to be moving below the waterline. So we want to be exploring the patterns that underlie events. So events typically aren't random. They're part of a bigger pattern. And those patterns, in turn, are shaped by the system structures or rules that are at play in the system. And those in turn are shaped by the paradigms or the way that we in society think about the world. So again, this model is really powerful. And just to use the Walmart example again, we might say, okay, well, what is the event we're seeing? So if I walk into my local Walmart store, I look around. Maybe I notice, there's a couple things here that are grown, in my state or in my area. But I'm noticing that 95% of the produce and almost everything else isn't grown locally. So in this case, I'm talking about the events, right? If I were to look at the pattern, the underlying pattern there might be that across the country, we find that on average only 5% of Walmart produce is grown within this state in question. So that's moving from the events to pattern, right? Another good example of this, of moving from the events to the pattern, has to do with climate change. So if we're looking at the weather on a given day, or wow, we just had a really huge cold spell, this climate change must not be happening. That's not the right level to be looking at it. If we're looking at the patterns, the long-term trends in the climate, we'll see some real changes. So that's just another example. If we were to look at the system structures or the rules underlying, say, the pattern of really an only limited amount of local produce at Walmarts across the country, we might find that the large-scale procurement and distribution systems that are in place fundamentally limit the ability to source local. And those are some of the loops we were looking at there. We might also find that large-scale global transport infrastructure is heavily subsidized, and that's facilitating some of the patterns that we're seeing. And if we dig even deeper and drill down on the paradigm level, we might find an approach that says, well, bigger is better, and that by scaling up, that will lead to economic prosperity for all. So that's just, again, a model that I find really helpful to encourage more systems thinking. And so then, once we've kind of been thinking about how we're looking at the challenges, it's really important to develop intervention strategies or our activities to try and make the food system a better place, to make them really work. So the idea here is that we want to be looking at places where small changes can lead to big impacts. So one concept here is that of leverage points, right? So a leverage point is a place in a complex system where a small shift in something can lead to a big shift in the system behavior. And we can often find these intuitively, but that's really it's a great language or lexicon for thinking about change. Where are the leverage points in the system? And that's really helpful in multi-stakeholder work especially. So that if we're looking at this iceberg model again, we see on the right here that as we drill down, we're increasing the leverage. And it's often a lot harder to change things lower down. It's hard to change the paradigms that inform our whole society. It's a lot easier to change events, but we're likely to create much deeper change in the system as we dive down. So for example, with our Walmart example, if I were intervening at the event level, I might mount a community letter writing campaign aimed at the store manager in my community to increase local food at the store, right? If I were intervening at the pattern level, I might mount a consumer campaign to pressure the company to change its procurement practices. If I was intervening at this level, at the structural level, I might lead an effort to shift state and federal investments from international ports to local food hubs, or I might propose a federal bill that incentivizes the purchasing of local food. So ways to make those structures easier. And if I were to intervene at the paradigm level, we might want to promote the idea that small is beautiful, that recirculating a food dollar locally is a good way to bring economic benefit to the land. So looking at these underlying structures and again shifting the blame is a nice way to think about intervening in systems. And here, I just want to touch on this briefly. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth, but this is an excerpt from one of the key readings that's in the resource pack that accompanies this webinar, which is Places to Intervene in a System by Danella Meadows. And this, she poses 12 levels of intervention in increasing order of effectiveness and difficulty. So again, it's this idea that, if we intervene and transcend paradigms, we're going to have the most impact across the whole system. Here, if we intervene in the goals and we change the goals of the system, that's perhaps the next powerful thing, all the way down. And so this article that's included does a great job. I highly recommend it. I read it at least once a year as a way of looking at the different levels that we can intervene in a system. And then the last point that I wanted to make here was just about solutions multipliers. So we want to find those leverage points that have the deepest impact on the system behavior, but we also want to address multiple issues laterally. So solutions multipliers are places where our intervention addresses multiple problems simultaneously. And this is really one of the places we should be looking at. So again, as we're working together, where are the solutions multipliers? What are the strategies and the tactics that affect all of our issues and result in deeper change in the system? And again, another reason why that's important is the urgency and the multitude of challenges we face and the limited resources. So, one example is farmers markets. Why are farmers markets so powerful? Well, they not only address and improve farm income and help farms be more viable in today's economy, but they increase consumers' knowledge of and connection to the food they eat. It increases the availability of healthy options in the local community. It reduces food miles and therefore fossil fuel use. It builds community. It's a great example of a solutions multiplier. And so we really want to be looking for those as we collaborate to make change in the system. So 2 more points before we wrap up. One is the importance of cultivating our ability to take a step back and gain a systems perspective, really seeing the forest for the trees. So one concept I want to cover here is that of vantage points. Wherever we sit in the system, we're not going to see the whole system. So here's one effort that tried to map out different stakeholders in the food system. So it's a nice place to highlight this point, right? Vantage points are frames. It's really about what's visible and what's not visible depending on where you sit in the system. Seeing from one vantage point, which we all do, one vantage point in the system is limited by definition. And where we sit informs our mental models, which are the kind of deeply held beliefs and assumptions about how the world works. So these are the kind of the deep grooves in our brain, the thought patterns and assumptions that come up for us again and again. So as change makers, we really want to observe and challenge these, right? We want to develop the ability to see our mental models, to see how we're thinking and how they might be limiting our ability to see the whole system and our assumptions. When we're too close, we can't really get perspective and see the whole. And systems thinking looks both from the inside out and the outside in, so that even when people in different parts of the system see the same situation, they're really likely to recognize different systems because of their different perspectives. When we see a situation, we see it through the eyes of where we sit in the system, but it's also deeply informed by our own culture, our own experiences, education, our disciplines, and our own special ability to think. So that our perspectives can really be quite different even when we're looking at the same world. And so it's important not just to talk about, talk among different parts of the system, but also exploring those other dimensions that make up our vantage points. Aha! So here is this problem again. So, now that we've kind of covered some of these ideas of systems thinking, I just want to highlight that this concept of vantage points and kind of zooming out. So when we look at this sentence, I think it's clear that there are 2 mistakes that show up really clearly. The is, it should be are, and mistakes is misspelled. But I just wanted to see is there anybody who can find the third mistake? Just raise your hand. Just click that little button that raises a hand, and Doris can unmute you. Anybody get it? Okay. Well, I guess I'll have to give it away then. The third mistake is one that really requires you to step outside of the sentence in order to see it. Right? The third mistake is that there are only two mistakes in the sentence. So the way, our mental model tends to keep us in the structure of the sentence, and we can only really see that third one when we take a step back. So that's just one example of shifting our mental model. So this ability to zoom in, to be this, in that subjective vantage point, which is really valid and important. We all have something important to offer from where we sit in the system. We don't want to throw that out, but that cultivating our ability to step outside the system is important too. And that's something we can really work on and cultivate, right? We can really catch our own limiting mental models by, for example, listing the challenges that we're thinking about or concerned about, and really asking if they exist inside or outside of our thinking. We can listen for certain phrases and judgments or universals in our language, right? And also just remembering that one of the best leverage points for change can often be the mental models that support the structure of the system, right? And so really ultimately what we're learning here is it has to really be about humility. It's really just such a great teacher. In really getting that we can't see the whole system, it really, I've found this personally, and I'm sure many of us have, that it just really instills a deep sense of humility to constantly have our eyes open by people who sit in different places, by constantly seeing the ways that our own thinking is limited. And that can often be not only vulnerable and scary, but it's not always that much fun to bump up against the limits of our thinking. But this ability to cultivate this bigger picture thinking is really a wonderful way to improve our systems thinking. And the last point before we wrap up is about collaboration. Collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. This is the easiest and best way to see out of our viewpoint, our vantage point, and see the whole system. It really helps us identify the solutions multipliers by working with people in other parts of the system. It helps us understand not only our point of view better, but others' points of view. Clarifies where we stand. We can often see ourselves through others' eyes. It's really, really hard work. We all know that. We all work in collaborative settings, but it's so rewarding. So, collaboration is really essential to connecting the different parts of the system, particularly since the flow of information is really what holds systems together and determines how they operate. So honing our communication and collaboration skills and increasing the quality of information is a core capacity of the systems lens. So with that, I just want to put a little bookmark in it. I want to invite everyone to visit this website, aginnovations.org/alliances/salon. There's some great readings there and some more videos and resources. So I just really, again, want to emphasize systems are complicated. They're nonlinear. Systems thinking is really about looking for the underlying structures and relationships that inform behaviors that we see. That there's really no blame. Often in systems problems, there's structural problems. They're about how the parts are fitted together. So, and that collaboration is critical. That we all collaborate to build a healthy food system. So no problem, as Einstein said, can ever be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it, and that's how systems thinking can help us. And so I'll leave it there, and Doris, I'll hand it back over to you for 5 minutes of any questions or comments.
Right. That was great, Katy. Thank you. No questions so far through the chat features here.
People with their hands raised.
Okay. Let's see here. Can you take those questions directly?
Sure. Yeah, Adrian Markworth. Did you want to say something or ask a question? And Doris, if you could just unmute everybody, I think that might be...
That would
The
help.
conference has been muted. The conference has been unmuted. The conference has been unmuted.
Great. Adrienne or Adrienne, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name. Do you want to go ahead? We're not hearing...
Everyone is unmuted.
Yeah,
So
everyone's
let's
unmuted
see.
here, so if you could just check your own phone, that would be great. And I think we lost Adrienne. But does anyone else have any questions or want to make any comments at this point? So
Okay, I have
here's
a question through the chat version option here from Becky Gershon. Question for Katy. Can you give an example of how you've used a system approach to solve a problem or work on an issue?
Sure. I can think of lots of examples just through working with Ag Innovations Network. But one that comes to mind is a project that we did with the California Roundtable on Water and Food Supply, which was really about affecting change at the paradigm level. So it was a project that brought together people working in all different parts of the food and water or agriculture and water system. And through a kind of collaborative dialogue, that group came to a point where it really shifted its thinking about how to approach water challenges from one that I would characterize as maybe sort of an engineering or plumbing paradigm to one of an ecological paradigm. And so that was a really powerful moment when this group kind of came to this idea of thinking about this in a new way. And that once that happened, people really started seeing how interacting with this living landscape and seeing the soil as a way to store water and this more kind of ecological paradigm, that it opened up a whole new set of thinking and ideas for how to interact with the system. So that's just one example. And there's another question here from Roby. Will the webinar recording be available for review? And yes, that will be available at the same link, aginnovations.org/alliances/salon, or you can just navigate there from the main page.
And
so
Katy will also send it out
yeah.
through the biweekly email in a couple of weeks.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. And Becky, if you're interested in other examples, feel free to email me later. There's lots of good ones. Okay. Any last questions here? Great. Doris, do you want to wrap it up then?
Yes. There are no more questions through the chat feature here. So unless anyone has any last second questions, we have come to the end of the webinar. There is somebody, yes? I heard somebody trying to get on the phone with a question, perhaps. If not, then, then thank you so much, Katy. This was
Thank you so much, Katy.
Very informational webinar, and I'm going to stop the meeting now so that the webinar evaluation can pop up on everyone's screen. And thank you so much, everyone, for participating. We really appreciate it, and we really hope that everyone learned something and has a few takeaways. So I'm going to hit the stop meeting button, and the evaluation will pop up. And thank you very much in advance for filling it out.
Thanks, Doris and Katy. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. I hope you managed to catch the end of that game now. If you're.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.